the number one predictor of suicide is untreated depression. Really talking about both unipolar depression and bipolar disorder. It used to be called manic depressive disorder, and it's now called bipolar disorder. But the kinds of depressions we usually talk about that are associated with suicide are of one of those two types. The suicide rates among people with bipolar disorder are some of the highest that we have among mental health disorders. And so it's very important to recognize that when you're talking about causality of suicide among adolescents and adults, that you recognize when we talk about these mood disorders, we're talking about depression, unipolar depression, as well as this bipolar disorder. Again, because those people with bipolar disorder are so at risk. In most of these cases, you'll probably are born with some sort of genetic predisposition to these issues, and then in all likelihood you've probably also had some environmental experiences that really kind of exacerbate or make it flourish. And so the general feeling is that it's probably an interaction effect. But certainly with these mood disorders, there's a strong genetic component to them. When we look at epidemiological studies, where they look at really family studies and family trees, what we see is that when it's present in the family tree, the likelihood of the offspring within that family tree of them having the disorder is greater than it is in groups that don't. And so we know that there's a strong genetic component, but there's also environmental things that cause this. So we know there are certain links with really traumatic childhood experiences and subsequent mood problems that can lead to these kind of life-ending issues. I've worked a lot with children and adolescents and adults, for that matter, that have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Mm-hmm. And there's been some data reported that showed that people that had kids, especially adolescents that had ADHD, were more prone to commit suicide. And there seems to be some mild statistical evidence in that regard. You have hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. And impulsivity is that business where we act without thinking, where the person will just impulsively respond to a situation without thinking through and understanding consequences and those kind of things. At any rate, we've seen suicide rates among that group be slightly higher than averages among adolescent groups. When we've explored that further, however, it seems to be more associated with the ADHD subgroup that develop conduct disorder, which is really law-breaking, which is kind of interesting. And so the group of kids that are most at risk when it comes to that ADHD group are also the group that have broke the law and have probably been adjudicated delinquents or have been on probation or whatever. That's the most at-risk group there. And so there is some data that suggests that whenever you have an adolescent that's developed some sort of what we call, some sort of psychopathological disorder, a mental health illness, whether it's ADHD, depression, whatever it is, that probably increases their likelihood of developing those other issues as well. So, but that's some of the causality of it. There are some things that have been shown to be very helpful with that process. Those things are psychopharmacological approaches. The second thing that's been shown to be very effective is individual and group therapies for depression. Lastly, the other thing, interestingly enough, that has been shown to be extremely important in treatment of depression is exercise. Another thing that's important to know, that once you've had a major depressive episode, I believe the data says you're 4 times more likely to have a second one. Now in psychology, when we're talking about assessment, our errors come either in a false positive sense or a false negative sense. There's a process called involuntary commitment where we again have somebody, and the state mental health system usually does that in this state, so somebody out of behavior management, which is our state mental health provider, they have people there that are identified that have been trained to do involuntary commitment.